The choice is not between cooperation and a Hobbesian war of all against all, but between free and forced association. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we'll be discussing this excellent book, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other, with Sheldon Richman. He is the executive editor of the Libertarian Institute, senior fellow and chair of the trustees at the Center for a Stateless Society, and a contributing editor at antiwar.com. Sheldon, sir, thank you for your time.
I appreciate the invitation. It's my pleasure.
So let's get to the heart of it. What do social animals owe to each other?
Yeah, that's the obvious question, isn't it? To sum it up, I could put it in one word. We owe them what we owe ourselves, namely reason. And I think I can spin it all out from that. It really goes back to the Aristotelian idea that we are social animals. He also used the term political animals, but using that in a very broad sense, we can adopt that. We're reason and language using animals, and to flourish, we need to be in society, and we need to deal with people on the basis of reason. That's how we flourish. It maximizes our chances of flourishing as human beings, which is, in the Aristotelian tradition means developing one's human potentials, which he also called the virtues, right? Achieving sort of human excellence. That's the reason. Reason and force, certainly the initiation of force, are opposites. Reason means persuasion, dealing with people as conversation partners, not as means to your own ends, but as ends in themselves. So that's what I mean. We owe others what we owe ourselves, reason.
There is a competing theory of what social animals owe to each other, and it goes something to the extent of social animals owe each other life. This includes healthcare, education, housing, food, etc., because we don't just live like Robinson Crusoe's all by ourselves. We live in a society. Therefore, I owe you the livelihood that you deserve, and you owe it to me, assuming, you can do it within reason. Why do you support the idea that we owe each other reason as opposed to actual tangible goods that allow us to survive?
Well, that quote, it seems to me, sets up a straw man or a false alternative, that it's a choice between the kind of a welfare state, whoever this person was advocating, if not even more outright state socialism. I don't know. On the one hand, and implying that the only alternative is a Robinson Crusoe existence. Robinson Crusoe for a while lived by himself and then had essentially a servant or a slave come along. But that doesn't exhaust the alternatives. The alternative is the vision that the libertarians, the liberals, we call them the radical liberals. I'll use that term liberal for libertarianism during this discussion. The model that that point of view puts forth is one of ongoing social cooperation, social living, exchange, and that doesn't exhaust the forms of cooperation. So when I say cooperation, I don't only mean the marketplace, although that's a very important and essential element of it, and it's a big part of it, but it's not the only thing. So we cooperate in all sorts of ways: for friendship, just helping others who may be on hard times or maybe in need, and you can render assistance. All those things are included in the sort of virtue that I'm talking about. But that also serves one's own flourishing, and so that makes for the good society, which then helps us achieve the good life.
I want to refer to Chapter 6 of What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. It's titled The Consequences of Liberty. So say that I'm someone who says, yes, this whole idea of reason and non-aggression is, a nice theory, but we live in the real world. I just want the poor to be taken care of. I don't want people discriminated against, and I want well-being. So if I got to use government force, hey, better luck in maybe good luck in getting someone elected to this government. But I mean, really, this is these principles are not really something that I value. How do you sell someone who's skeptical about freedom on the consequences of liberty?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the record of the state of government is not very good in helping the very people that this person wants to help. The record of the state is one of essentially, most often helping the privileged, the well-connected, at the expense of the people who are not well-connected, which tend to also be lower income people. Not only lower income people, but lower income people. So the state is not a very promising vehicle for that. And those kinds of problems, public choice problems, they're called, have been discussed extensively, both in theoretical terms and historical terms. There's quite a huge literature on why the state is not something to look forward to or look to for so-called humanitarian solutions. On the other hand, we need to keep in mind that we need to ask what lifted the human race out of poverty to begin with. Poverty is the natural state, right? Wealth is not the natural state. As Adam Smith and many others have pointed out, it's not poverty that needs to be explained. It's wealth that needs to be explained. And if we look at, again, history and theory, and so we can always do both things, they complement each other. We see that what enabled the human race to climb out of poverty is the freedom to engage in entrepreneurship, economic initiative, exchange, division of labor, social cooperation. All that can be summed up by the words social cooperation. So I think that's the dual answer to this kind of concern, that when you attempt to have the state take from some people to give to other people, invariably it ends up taking from the bulk of people who are not wealthy and giving it to people who already have a great deal and are well connected, and much of what they have they got through political favoritism anyway. It's known as rent seeking. So that's how to approach the answer to that.
Now, why should people embrace the libertarian approach as opposed to maybe we just need to fix the rent-seeking? Government is just a mechanism by which society reflects its ideas. It's much like a person would use a wrench. So why is the solution not to make sure we spend a lot of resources focusing on getting the right people elected who really care about the public at large?
Well, the first thing you said was, why don't we focus on getting rid of rent seeking? But of course, it would be the state operatives that would be doing the getting rid of rent seeking. So they're not exactly trustworthy figures in that regard. I don't see why we would want to trust them. To try to do it through representative government or democracy is problematic, because there's a big problem with responsibility and accountability. No one vote counts in any given election. You may make an exception for the tiniest of towns, maybe that has 10 people, and then one vote maybe has some clout, but it's still only one vote. In a typical election, and this counts for presidential elections and the senatorial and the House of Representative elections, one vote is like a drop in the ocean. And I've been around a long time, and I can think back over the elections I've lived through, and there's not a single one that would have come out differently had I done something differently on something different on election day, whether that was voting or whether that was not voting or voting for one of the candidates. I haven't voted for a long time, but I guarantee you that no outcome would have changed. No individual can change the outcome, and people grasp that. I mean, no matter how much they're hammered over the head with the idea that every vote counts, they know it. Come on, they're not stupid. That's math. That's arithmetic. You learn that in grade school. But the League of Women Voters and the parties, of course, always lie to us and tell us how important every vote is. But people know it isn't, and so that enables them to vote then sort of irresponsibly, because they're not going to make a difference, for one thing. Plus the costs, even if the person they favor gets in, the costs that person will impose will be spread out among hundreds. Well, we have 30 million people, not all are adult taxpayers, but over a couple 100 million people, which means any any individual will absorb only a small share. However, the cost in terms of interference with people's free activities, including what we call economic activities, is huge, because you're sucking wealth away from producers and giving it to government consumers, and much of which it hands on to other people, like the military-industrial complex, right? The military contractors. They're not making goods for consumers. And all the other money that's diverted to the government's clients is money taken away from projects which would serve consumers. And so, that's my answer to that. That simply trying to fix it through voting is not going to work. As somebody once said of who was it, Emma Goldman or somebody, if voting could change things, it would be illegal.
That's funny. So we have a clear economic difference, as well as an incentive difference between the public and the private sector. But sometimes these are not very clear categories. For example, Raytheon, but you have someone who's so heavily funded by the state and the Department of Offense, but it's still a private company. You have places like Facebook, also suffering from the same things. Amazon having a big deal with the Central Intelligence Agency, up to, I believe it was $600 million. What would you say is the principal difference between the state and private homeowners associations and corporations?
Well, it's true that the line can get blurred, because you can have companies that have some of their operations aimed at producing consumer goods, or producers' goods that will then be used to produce consumers' goods. So they could be, a couple steps upstream from the consumer. That's not a problem. But at the same time, the government spends so much and contracts so much that plenty of companies are kind of in both spheres. Well, the only thing I'd say about that is we need to attack the spending and the projects and the missions of the state. In the short run, my ultimate preference is to get rid of the state altogether, but I'm not against incremental moves towards scaling back its powers where we can, and scaling back its missions. And so that would mean less contracting, which would mean less tax money flowing to companies, and let them then concentrate on private activities. Now, the second part of your question, I'm kind of forgetting right now. How did you follow?
It was what is the principled difference? This way, we don't have to look into every single instance. What we can be able to judge for ourselves. Principled difference between public sector and private sector.
Well, yeah, you mentioned homeowners associations, which is a good example that does come up sometimes. Homeowners associations, may on the surface resemble the state, but in a libertarian society, that would just be one competitive arrangement that would be up against not only similar arrangements, in other words, other housing communities that have similar associations, but other forms of association that maybe we haven't even thought of yet. That's what entrepreneurs do, right? They think up things we haven't thought of yet. You and I sitting here may draw a blank, and tomorrow, if there's a profit incentive, somebody we couldn't even predict will hit on an idea. Then we hit ourselves in the head and say, why didn't we think of that? We could have been wealthy today, Keith, you and me, Keith. So we don't know what would be discovered. So we need to sweep away the government barriers to things, and that includes building permits, zoning. We need a blossoming of a social cooperation. The government, by nature, impedes social cooperation. The kind of person you were quoting in the beginning makes the mistake of thinking the government is the engine of social cooperation, that we need it, or else we get just cutthroat competition, right? Dog eat dog. We have all these terms that are put before the word competition to make it sound something ugly. And I think that's part of the problem. People think competition is something ugly, and what they like is the warm, cozy feeling they get from the word cooperation. What I show in the book is that cooperation and competition are two sides of the same coin. One flows from the other. So, simple example, I walk into a shopping mall, at least pre-pandemic, I walk into a shopping mall and I need shoes. Okay, I'm only in the market for one pair of shoes. There are 3 stores. offering shoes. Now, it's true the three of them are competing. And if I buy shoes that day, one will make the sale, two will not make the sale. But what are they competing to do? They're competing to cooperate with me. I'm a would-be cooperator when I walk in. The question is, should I be free to choose with whom I cooperate, or should the state tell me with whom I will cooperate? Forced cooperation doesn't sound so cozy and nice and warm, does it? It doesn't sound nice at all. But free cooperation, where I get to choose because I decide where the biggest advantage is for me, who has the best quality product, who's got the best price, who has best follow-up service if I need it. Maybe even I like the store, but it's nicer atmosphere in the store. Whatever the reasons may be, those are very personal and subjective. Shouldn't I get to decide? So in other words, if I'm free to choose with whom, and the rest of us are free to choose with whom we will cooperate, the byproduct of that is going to be competition. I don't see how there's any way around it. So if you like cooperation, you have to like competition too. Now, competition isn't cutthroat or dog eat dog, because what happens if, let's say, one of the shoe stores goes out of business because it's right at the margin and it needed my sale to stay in business. That the owner of that store doesn't die. We don't take him out and shoot him because he lost the competition. He's not even shamed. It's not a shame. Entrepreneurs go out of business and make mistakes in their calculations and their guesses about the future all the time. They go on to start another business, or they go to work for one of the other stores, or they don't die. So it's not like war. I know people like to use warfare and sort of the law of the jungle. That's another one. Warfare metaphors, but those are totally inappropriate.
I totally agree with that, especially if you take your 3 shoe store example. You also have to see that each store individually has to cooperate with, I don't know, 10 million people in order to have a store. I mean, how is a shoe made? It's much like the Leonard Reed example of a pencil. You have to have people who chop down the wood. Well, they have to cooperate with people who make the cars and sell the cars and pump air in the tires. This is a big web of cooperation. Excellent. Where it's much more complex than exploiter and exploited. So that I think is vital to get across. Which
very good point. It's the original World Wide Web. when you think about it. Yeah. And web is the word. All kinds of interconnections, and now it's global, which is a good thing, because that means a greater division of labor, more specialization, which means cheaper goods, new ideas all the time. And there's my favorite line in Ludwig von Mises' great treatise, Human Action, which, by the way, he was originally wanted to call social cooperation, but he calls it human action. The great line is the fact that other people want shoes, as I do, doesn't make it harder for me to get shoes, but easier. Because you have economies of scale and the specialization, which brings down the real cost, the real price of things, and makes things more and more accessible, which is why living standards worldwide have been rising for many years. In the last 20 or so years, extreme poverty has dropped in half. But if you just look at the progress of all of the human race since toward the end of the 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution begins, there's this historically, amazing and unprecedented growth in the general welfare, in the sense of general wealth. I mean, it was flat for a very long time, right from the beginning of human history that we know of. Per capita wealth very, very low, and life extent very low, and then beginning in 1750, as we get toward the end of that century, you see this huge jump. Now, is it even all over the world at once? No, of course not, because some places had more freedom than others. Liberalism took root in some places. It took longer than in others, but it still was all improving, even if at different rates. And there's no denying that. It's just no denying. Even Marx agreed with that. Now, let me say one more thing, just real fast, because I know you got questions. When I talk about the Industrial Revolution, I am not endorsing everything that went on in the name of industrialization. The British government took land that was that people had customary rights to, and enclosed it and gave it to favored interests. You had intellectual property like patents and things, which gave, in my view, illegitimate gains to, again, favored interests. And so it's not a blanket endorsement of everything that went on, but if you clear that kind of brush away, you can still see the core, namely that where freedom was allowed and where your possessions were more or less secured and not just going to be taken, without notice from you, wealth increases in a general sense.
Another thing that I've heard of that, people like Deirdre McCluskey and I've even heard Louis Farrakhan say that we have to sort of marry economic freedom with social honor. So even if there's just freedom, if everyone sees you as sort of a cheat or a moron or a loser or a sellout, because you are trying to be entrepreneurial, trying to work hard, trying to save and invest, you also are not going to get the results just because you have the freedom without the social honor. Do you think there's also a cultural aspect that needs to be embraced on top of the non-aggression principle in private property?
No, I agree. If middlemen throughout history have been despised and hated. Very often they've been minorities. They've been minorities in the country they lived in. This is the case with Jews in Eastern Europe. Thomas Sowell gives many examples. The Chinese in Southeast Asia, they whether for legal restrictions or not, they often got into the brokerage, buying and selling, which can be a perfectly useful and legitimate function, because it's not always obvious to people who are looking to buy something. It's not always obvious where those goods are, and people who are looking to sell something, it's not always obvious to them where the potential buyers are. What a middleman can do, again, when he's without government favors, and of course these are minority. Don't forget, these are minority communities. They weren't getting favors from the government, right? They weren't part of the majority. What they can do is match up buyers and sellers who haven't found each other and might have to undergo a lot of search costs to find each other. That's what a go-between does, and what we call a middleman. But in many cultures, that has been a dirty word, and those people have suffered. And so envy, and those sorts of feelings, and the way they manifest themselves culturally, can be a definite drag on economic growth, because you make people. You impede people's activities. If they could do it openly without any fear, you're going to get more of it. So I agree. I didn't know that about Farrakhan, but I certainly respect Deirdre McCloskey's work a huge amount.
Yes, like Thaddeus Russell says, war is the health of the state, but shame is also the health of the state. So there's also a cultural aspect to, I mean, no one's going to shoot me if I say something, if I criticize the police in front of my, relative who's a police officer, but they're all going to shame me. And that ends up creating more of a disincentive than, if I was genuinely terrified the CIA was going to kidnap me for speaking out. So shame and the cultural aspect, I think, are very, very big aspects of this. I love chapter 3, one moral standard for all. What is one moral standard for all that you embrace in this book?
Well, it's simply, it gets back to what I said, we owe each other. I think that's the chapter where I begin by saying libertarians sometimes are very pessimistic that they have such a long way to go. But when I try to point out, and others have pointed this out, it's not an original point with me, I think we could say, being a little bit glib here, that most people already are part libertarian. I would say more than halfway. Because in their daily lives, most people abide by the kind of ethic that's embodied in the libertarian worldview, the liberal view. They don't strike or assault their neighbors or just other people. They don't take their stuff, to quote, borrow, right, without asking, and they abide by their contracts, where they can. There are extreme cases where and there are always people who don't care about that stuff, but I'm talking about by and large. So people live as libertarians. They, at a minimum, live and let live, but they even do more than that. There's productive relationships and friendships and all that sort of thing. So what we need to do is tell them that there's no reason why that ethic shouldn't apply to people who call themselves government officials. Why it doesn't the same rule? Why are they allowed to hit, imprison? I mean, we don't imprison. That's another thing we don't do with our neighbors and even just strangers. Lock them in cages when they're committing some vice or something we don't like. Why do officers, people who call themselves state officials, why are they allowed to do that? How do they have the right to do it? Now, one answer people will give is, well, they were voted in, or they were hired by people voted in. But as Frederick Bastiat, who was the great liberal economist of the first half of the 19th century in France, great radical liberal, we could call him, pointed out, no group can have any right that isn't possessed by each of the individual members of the group. So you put a whole bunch of zeros together, you still have zero. So if I don't have the right to imprison my neighbor because he's smoked a joint, and you don't have the right to imprison your neighbor because he's he smoked a joint, you and I getting together, we outnumber him. We're the majority, right, of the three. It's 2 against 1. We don't somehow gain the right to imprison him because he's smoking a joint. And so if we can't do that, I don't see how we can vote other people to have that power or that quote right. And therefore, the whole thing doesn't get off the ground.
Sure. It really is this underlying consistency that exposes the fact that libertarian voluntarism and anarchism is the only consistent natural law approach. Everything else is arbitrary and inconsistent. So we could have sort of if Libertarian Institute, this group of people, doesn't have the right to do it, how come government has the double standard? Even if you say, you know what, yeah, I don't care about the state, but I have the right to steal, well, then that means everyone has the right to steal from you, and then everyone has the right to steal from them, and everyone should be constantly stealing. But you can't justify that, because to steal it, you have to own it. And if you justly own it, then it's not theft. So only the libertarian worldview can be justified. I think you do an excellent job in this book of explaining that. Mm-hmm. I want to ask about chapter 24, the Austrian Exploitation Theory. What is the Austrian Exploitation Theory?
Well, exploitation theory is usually considered a wholly owned subsidiary of Marxism, because he had a theory of how when people work for other people, they are exploited. There's some difference among Marx and Engels and then later Marxists about whether this was required state power or whether it was just inherent in the employment relationship. But whichever it is, that we don't need to resolve that here. His point was that the worker is not getting all that he deserves because he's exploited, right? Because the employer is skimming away some of the reward. It's not getting the full reward. By the way, it's interesting. Just as a side note, we were talking about property. That sounds like a property rights argument, right? It sounds like Marx is saying, well, doesn't the worker have a property right in the full value of the product that he produces? And if the employer is taking some of it, his property has been diminished. Some of his property has been seized illegitimately. I mean, that seems to be a perfectly fine way to restate what Marx was saying. And yet Marx favored abolition of private property. So I don't see how that serves the cause of ending exploitation if you want to abolish private property. There's a property rights argument in the idea of exploitation. However, I think Marx gets it wrong. And the great Austrian economist, the second generation Austrian economist who was also at the University of Vienna after Karl Menger, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, wrote a little book, chapter refuting the Marxian point by saying this: when if a person goes to work for somebody else, and it's completely, I'm assuming it's a completely voluntary relationship, the state has not put its thumb on the scale on behalf of the employer, which historically it has done, but let's leave that aside. We're talking about employment in a truly free market, or what a friend of ours says, free in a freed market, because it's not free today. When that person is hired, the typical wage agreement, and it's the way it works today, the typical arrangement is that the worker is going to get paid weekly or biweekly, right, or once a month or whatever, something like that. It's on a time schedule. He's not told, okay, you can work for me, you're using my tools and machines, but you're not going to get paid until the product sells. And let's say it's making a car or making something that takes a substantial amount of time, not just a little widget, but something that takes some time. That would mean the employees would have to wait a while until it sells. And what if it doesn't sell? Does that mean he never gets paid? That's not the kind of arrangement that I think most, and that's not the way it works today, and it's not the way I think most wage laborers would want it. I mean, they go into it probably for the regularity and the more or less certainty that on the second Friday, every other Friday, they get their paycheck. Okay, so that leads to a question. If the product hasn't sold yet, doesn't that mean the employer is advancing money to the employee because the product hasn't sold yet, right? He hasn't gotten the money from his potential buyers in the future. That may be in the future, maybe long in the future. Again, it depends on what kind of product we're talking about. So he's making an advance. He's giving a loan. Some of the payment is a loan. So that means what they're getting, and given the idea of time preference, right, that we prefer present goods to future goods, and therefore we do a discount on the present good. If you win the lottery, you can take payout. If they say $100 million, that means you're going to get it paid out, right, over a long period of time, 20 years or something. Or you can take a lump sum today, but the lump sum is going to be less than the big payout because you don't want the time to go by. So so it gets discounted, and lots of people are willing to do that. So same thing. So the amount that the employer gets as a result of this is what he gets back when the product sells is really interest on the portion of the pay that was a loan, because he waited for the sale rather than the employee waiting for the sale. So that was Bombervert's answer. Now, I tried to add to that, because when you say that the amount is discounted, it's discounted by what? It's discounted by a rate of interest. That's what interest is, right? It's discounting the future value to the present. If it's going to be discounted, then the question is the government in any way interfering with the setting of that interest rate, that implicit interest rate? And I point out in that chapter all the different ways the government can, in effect, lower that rate of interest. Raise the rate of interest so that the employer takes a bigger and bigger cut under this Bombervert scheme, under this explanation that I just gave. And it can do that in lots of ways. One way it can do it is by making it much more difficult for people to go into business for themselves, work for themselves, or start businesses with a couple of their neighbors, right? A small scale business. The government does this in all kinds of ways: permits, occupational licensing, zoning, where you can't operate a business from your house. And all the ways it does that act as in a sense, forces people into wage labor, because the other alternatives are closed off. Doesn't mean everybody would take those alternatives, but they're there as a competitive pressure on an employer. If you have other opportunities, because the government is not blocking them, then it's much easier to go to your employer and say what that old song said: take this job and shove it. But if the government has blocked off lots of alternative avenues, it's much tougher to tell your boss when you're unhappy to take your job and shove it. So that enables him to exploit his employees because that interest rate, like I say, is artificially rises. The employer may not even realize it's happening. So he's not an exploiter in the sense of, he's wringing his hands. I'll get my workers. I'll screw my workers. He may not even know what's going on. The fact is, the government forces up that interest rate, and therefore it's like kind of like almost like loan sharking. Without the employer involved in physical force, but he's able to extract more from the worker as a result of all those things, all those barriers I mentioned that the state erects to free enterprise.
Of course, and as an employee, you have far fewer choices, less competition, and they can easily see this when it comes to voter ID. They go, well, this is a barrier to entry, so you're going to get fewer people voting. It's like, okay, yeah, an ID is annoying. It takes a couple days to get. But the amount of government regulations you have to comply with to get a business started, the producers need permission from the people voting for a bigger state. The producers need permission from the parasites in order to start engaging in voluntary exchanges to the tune of, gosh, OSHA, like in Arizona, you have OSHA and the Department of Agriculture don't even talk to each other. So they have contradictory standards to where you literally have to choose who are you going to get fined by, because it's everything from which way the door opens in restaurants to all this trivial nonsense. So it's like, yes, a license to vote hampers voting a little bit. All these major regulations for business really hampers business innovation, giving us less products, less services, higher prices. The effects of the belief in authority, or rather the belief in statism or the belief in government, has so many terrible effects. I'm curious, do you have a theory as to how the state tricks people into having this double standard in their minds, that violence isn't violence when Congress does it?
Well, I think it goes back to the theory of representative government. I don't know if the piece where I discussed this, it may not be in this book, but there was someplace, I think in the Freeman long ago, where I did some writing about this. And the idea of representative government, part of the idea behind the selling of representative government was, since the people doing the things the government does are said to be representatives or theoretically representatives, then of the greater, of the populace, how can the populace complain? They're your representatives. So it was a great way to diffuse criticism of the state, because it was like you're criticizing yourself. These are our people. And they also sold the idea that there was almost something mystical about elections, right? They may concede that okay, one vote doesn't count, but when we all get together, something happens, right? And you hear the elections talked about that way. There's something magical or mystical that goes on when a whole group of us go to the polls on the same day and vote. It still doesn't change the fact that if any one of those people stayed home, in 99.99999 cases and beyond, it'd make no difference. And so, government has always been sold on the basis of a mystique. When government was united with religion, the priests were the sort of ideological salesmen. We had the divine right of kings, and you should obey the government because it's God's agent on earth. And they were selling that through religion. But once politics became secular, and then it became democratic and Republican, the small R Republican, you still had an intelligentsia who sold the idea that this is the general will expressing itself, kind of the Rousseau idea that it's the general will. And so and then you had the other idea that if you participate, your freedom consists in being able to participate. What happens afterwards, after the policy is determined, is not where you decide whether you're free or not. It's the fact that you had some voice, and the voice can maybe very small in the sense of I can go and cast my one vote out of 100 million, 200 million votes, or even hundreds of thousands of votes.
You have an excellent chapter, chapter 41. We can oppose bigotry without politicians. This is a big one today where you see it's
Yeah.
like, well, we have such an entrenched history of misogyny and oppressing the downtrodden, especially against blacks, Japanese internment camps, terrible treatment of minorities. Does the fact that majorities can sometimes gang up on minorities justify the existence of a state?
Well, that would be odd because the state usually was the club that the bigots used to to keep. I mean, let's go back to slavery. Slavery was not some kind of private sector project. It was the state. The state passed laws to compel the return of runaway slaves, the Fugitive Slave Act. The state governments in the Confederacy conscripted people to hunt down runaway slaves. That's conscription. That was state power. So it's not private. The government regarded it as until the 13th Amendment regarded it as an entirely legal institution. Jim Crow, which followed, what were state laws mandating segregation in public accommodations, restaurants, and things like that, in other ways. Now, not all racial discrimination is state-sponsored, or very often it's echoing from state sponsorship, but the government can still sustain it in various ways. One thing that works against competition, so it works against bigotry of all kinds, not just racism, is free competition when it's allowed to operate, because then the people who are discriminated against have alternatives. And now it's not and also if you're bearing the full cost of your bigotry, uh, let's say you're not going to hire some talented people because they're a certain color or gender or religion, uh, there's going to be some cost to you because you're turning away talented people or customers, let's say. Now, that's not a total guarantee that will drive all bigotry out of the marketplace, because some people are willing to give up some money to indulge their bigotry. But the question is, how many people does that account for? The historical point I make in that piece is that before the 64 Civil Rights Act, which not only outlawed state discrimination like Jim Crow laws, but also allowed private discrimination in restaurants, hotels, what we call public accommodations, not meaning government, but public accommodations. Before that, private action without any state support was succeeding in ending the segregation or the exclusion of blacks from the lunch counters in the South. There were nationwide boycotts and then local negotiations between the people who were staging those student sit-ins. Right, they would sit at the counter and they when asked to leave, they wouldn't leave, but they would just let themselves passively be carried out. They didn't use any force. In fact, force was used against them. Sometimes they get a punch, on the way out by some patron. They were allowed in the shops they were allowed to come into the shop to buy things, Woolworths and those other small, those department stores in those days. They weren't kept out of the store. They just weren't allowed to sit at the lunch counter because whites, they thought whites didn't want people, and a lot of whites didn't want people of color sitting next to them. But those were changing both through nationwide boycotts and other kinds of pressure. Before that, there was a great, very freedom-oriented black leader named T.R.M. Howard. David Beto, a historian, and his wife wrote a book about T.R.M. Howard. He had launched, this was still in the 50s, so well before the 64 Act, he launched a nationwide boycott to end the gas stations, which were chains, mostly chains, the gas stations from keeping blacks out of the restrooms. He succeeded at doing that by mounting a nationwide boycott. So if anything, the federal government was piggybacking on what private effort was already doing. And I think one of the downsides of that was it shifted policy and decision-making to the white elite in Washington, rather than there on the ground in the southern states. where direct action, but nonviolent, direct action was putting an end to this ugly treatment of people. Also, you can look at all the ways those states and cities kept competition from arising. So if another lounge counter wanted to open up across the street that would welcome Black patrons, they were going to have trouble one way or another. Licensing, permits, and possibly even the Klan would give them some trouble if they didn't toe the line. But you might say, well, the Klan, so can't they call the police? Unfortunately, a lot of the police were members of the Klan, so there was no guarantee you couldn't turn to the law. So there was plenty of state intervention there sustaining segregation and bigotry.
Exactly. I mean, I would get in trouble at work if I said, screw you to one customer. Imagine if we had a screw you policy to 13% of the population, Blacks, and then another 20-30% of the population, Hispanics, and then add the LGBT community onto that. It's like it would be so costly to get away with that, to discriminate against, even one person. Every customer we're expected to be nice to, which is a great thing. So the idea that the private sector would yield this bigotry and this hatred and this lack of cooperation is just so the opposite of reality. I want to ask you about chapter 57, the myth of market failure. What is the myth of market failure?
Well, market failure is the idea that there can be situations in which if each individual does what he believes is best for him, then the overall situation that comes out of that is something that no one would like. And so it's thought that it's also known as the problem of collective action. So this has often been used as a reason for why we need to have a monopoly government, because it can compel all the members of the society to behave in that way. So even if they individually don't want to behave that way, they're going to like the overall outcome. That's kind of the theory. But that chapter was based on a very good talk and the article written by David Freeman, very good libertarian, anarchist, son of Milton Friedman, who wrote about that at length. And one of the points I make in there, he calls it market failure, but which I said was a little odd, because he shows it's not just a phenomenon of the market. It can turn up in lots of different things that have nothing to do with the market. So why would you call it a market failure? Maybe there's a problem. There can be potential problems of collective action. One thing, of course, he shows, and the public choice school has shown, is that government itself suffers from the same kind of failure. Or change in government can suffer from the same kind of failure. Let's say I'm in a group of people who would like to have lower taxes. Okay, we get together and we all agree, yeah, we want to lobby for a bill to lower taxes. So I volunteer. I don't volunteer. I offer to go to Washington to be the lobbyist for our group. It's I live in Little Rock. Little Rockers for lower taxes. So it takes money, right? I need money, and I'm going to need, copy machine and laptop. So I say to everybody, okay, I need everybody to chip in. I can't tax them. We're not government. So I need everybody to chip in. Now everybody can think, free rider problem is an example here, right? Everybody can think, well, they can calculate. Well, let's see. If he gets the tax cut, I'm gonna get the tax cut. If he gets it passed, my taxes will be cut. And my taxes will be cut whether I chip in or not, whether I toss money into the hat or not. So let's say, give an extreme example. There are ways to overcome this, but an extreme example. If everybody thinks that, calculating, hey, what do I need to chip in? I'm going to get the benefit without the cost. Then, of course, he gets no money and he doesn't go to Washington and he doesn't lobby for the bill, and we don't get our taxes cut. So it's an example. We don't like the outcome. We each did what we individually thought was to our own advantage, but in the end, we're not happy. None of us is happy with the outcome. Now, of course, there are ways to get around that. But let's go back to the state. what Freeman wants to argue, and I totally embrace what he says here, is that when these kinds of failures occur in the case of the state, there's no easy way to fix it. You know, if a government agency fails, that's offered as a case for why it needs more money, not less money, right? It needs a bigger budget, not a smaller budget. On the other hand, when these kinds of failures occur in the marketplace, there's already the potential for a solution, because market problems contain the seeds of their own solution. And that's called entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs profit by solving problems that no one else before this one particular person solved, by being alert to a possible solution. And so it sets in motion, a correction problem. You don't get that. You don't have entrepreneurship. In government, government's bureaucracy. It's not profit driven, so it doesn't have the incentives that a private entrepreneur has. And so this problem of collective action, or that's one of the terms used, is much more manageable. May not go away totally, but it's much more manageable because there's an automatic mechanism kind of in society, in the marketplace. But it's not manageable in government. In fact, it tends to get aggravated because the government will ask for more money to solve a problem that it helped to cause in the first place.
Of course. I mean, it's like, what percentage of people were behind the U.S. entering the Vietnam War? It's like there were a few. It was like McNamara, Lyndon B. Johnson gives the Gulf of Tonkin speech, and yet millions of people are killed. 1 million men are enslaved to fight in the war, getting their hands blown off, PTSD, getting killed themselves, 58,000. So the idea that, well, people might, A and B might get together and hurt C in a free market. That's all that happens when the state gets involved. They're constantly, whether you think it's actively conspiring or they just don't care. I mean, the politicians don't call us and ask us, hey, is it all right if I, lock down the country for about 4 months and, imprisoning pregnant women in Australia for a Facebook post? It's the most ridiculous thing how they can't even.
And wars always have lies at the base of them, right? It's a manufactured consent, to use a chapter title from one of Noam Chomsky's books. The Gulf of Tonkin was not what it was represented as, that incident. Exactly. There was not a torpedo attack by the North Vietnamese, and they knew it. They knew it early on, that it was something to do with the radar. I mean, you can read Daniel Ellsberg's I think his last book, not the last book about nuclear war, the one before that, I forget the name of it. He goes into detail, and he was working in the Defense Department at the time. So we know this. The Spanish-American War began, remember the Maine, as if the Spanish had blown up this ship that was in the harbor there at Havana. Now I think I don't know what the current theory is, but it seems like the best explanation was the boiler. The boiler blew up, but that doesn't matter. And do I need to remind everybody of George Bush's Iraq War, WMD? They never found any WMD. And at the time, people were saying, the UN investigators, UN inspectors, like Scott Ritter, were saying, these are thorough inspections and we're not finding WMD. But there was a big lie that there were WMD. Colin Powell, joined in, and Joe Biden, to sell that war to the American people on the basis of Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and biological weapons.
And head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, testified saying Saddam has them. They made up the lie about Muhammad Atta meeting in Prague. They made up the Joe Wilson, Valerie Plame lie that there was yellow cake bought in Niger. There was the Iraq War I lie of babies in incubators with the Nyaria testimony. So this is an actual pattern. It's not, well, one time a thing happened. This is the rule of thumb for getting people into wars and sort of getting a rallying around the flag effect. You have a great chapter, The Importance of Subjectivism in Economics. Why is subjectivism important in the economic field?
And I do want to distinguish it from subjectivism and other things, right? In philosophy and ethics, or metaphysics or epistemology. I mean, I think there's a real objective world out there that we have access to. It's intelligible, and we deal with it every day. So I'm talking purely about economics. Well, this is again in the Austrian tradition, Menger, Baumgartner, and then you get Mises and Hayek and on, Rothbard, Israel Kirzner. What it's saying is that when a social scientist or an economist is observing an economy, he's got and is interpreting what's going on, he has to never forget that what is motivating the activity he sees down there is the valuation that the individual people that he's observing are putting on things. They're buying and selling or abstaining from buying and selling on the basis of their own perception of what that's available, what's being offered for sale, is useful, valuable, how they can use it in their lives. Something that somebody finds no use for, he's not going to pay for. Zero use for it. He's not going to pay. He's not going to give up, because when you pay for something, I mean, you're not just giving away money, because you would have used that money for something else. So what you're really doing is giving away the thing you could have used the money for. And that could even include savings, because when you save, you're in a way you're buying some security, right? A rainy day fund, or you're buying the prospect of consuming more in the future by saving and making interest. Well, you always have an opportunity cost when you buy something. What you're really giving up is alternative uses of that money. But it's not the economist observing this that can draw sort of judgments about whether what's being done is good or bad or right or wrong. He's an observer and an explainer of what's going on. And so he has to look at it from the point of view of the actors, and they're motivated by their real world concerns, choosing alternatives that they encounter, maybe unforeseen alternatives that they encounter, in just day-to-day life. They didn't know some option was available. So now they make maybe a quick or a lengthy calculation about whether to go for that, to give up something else to get that, or no, I'll stick with my plan and not go for this new thing that I came across. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by subjective. And so the price of things there's no objective price to things, right? Price vary. That includes gold. Price varies according to people's appraisal of those things. And so it will rise and fall as people decide they like something, they don't like something, they like A more than B. Something that they were willing to pay a lot for could drop mightily in value next week if some entrepreneur comes up with a better alternative that kind of delivers the same service, but in a better, new, innovative way. And so they now say, lots of people say, oh, I want that to satisfy my need X. I don't want the old thing anymore. So now those companies that were making the old thing, maybe have to go out of business or retool and make something else. That's what I mean by subjective. It's basically personal.
And final question, Milton Friedman said that there's two main opponents to the market economy. We have professors and academics, and then we have businessmen. Usually, I mean, before I started studying, it was always, well, the businessmen just all want a free market. The more I look into it, they're all big advocates of statism and regulation and coercive involvement in voluntary exchanges. Why is it that we see business wanting a bigger government?
Well, and I'm not going to say it's unanimous. You're going to find, it may be rare, but you're going to find the business person who really does have a ideological belief, moral belief in liberty. He wants liberty for himself, and he recognizes that other people are also entitled to liberty. But people generally take the path of least resistance, and so if government looks like a surer way to lock down your market share or lock in your profits by somehow thwarting your components or your potential components, like through licensing, right? You keep people from even getting into the field, then you'll go that route and spend money on getting a government favor if the benefit you're going to get from that by excluding competition or harming competition is much larger than the amount you invest in the lobbying or in the activity, in the rent-seeking activity. We call it rent-seeking. So I think that's one answer. It's not so much an ideological commitment to government, although some may be committed, but it looks like the cheaper route to get what you want, and they don't have scruples that it requires thwarting other people.
Terrific. Mr. Richman, thank you so much for your time. I definitely recommend the book, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. My favorite thing is that there's like 70 something chapters. So
Yes.
there's 72 chapters, and you're able to, sit down and get a quick thing in and get a quick chapter in while you're just
Yep.
waiting for the water to boil on the stove. So it's just so convenient.
Thank you very much.
And they not only complement each other one after the other, you can go back and read Monopoly and Aggression and get a good reminder of the libertarian view on that. So, sir, I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate all that you just said and having me on, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So thank you.
Take care.